About 30 miles north of Fairbanks, deep in the Alaskan wild, there's a research facility called Poker Flat. Here, rockets are assembled by NASA scientists and launched into the Earth's upper atmosphere. For what purpose? Well, I suspect it's partly because they just like doing it. But a sign on one of the doors at Poker Flat reveals another motive. It reads, quote, "The Center for the Study of Something," which, on the face of it, might seem trivial, but on closer examination, takes on global significance, unquote. It's as good a description as any for a phenomenon that has inspired centuries of mythology, scientific inquiry, and awe. The Aurora Borealis. Hi, I'm Nate Hinchy, and this is Cool Shit, the podcast. This is a show about interesting topics from science, history, the arts, and more. In other words, if it fascinates me, I'm going to talk about it. I know that the world can sometimes seem like an awfully depressing place, but trust me when I say, there's some pretty cool shit out there. In the early 17th century, Galileo Galilei coined the phrase Aurora Borealis. He took the name from Aurora, the Roman goddess of the dawn, and Boreas, the Greek god of the northern wind. Italy, where Galileo was born and raised, is well south of what is known as the auroral zone, the area near the poles where auroral activity is most easily observed. Galileo, if he saw the aurora at all, would have witnessed a largely red, dawn-like display, a far cry from the vibrant green, yellow, pink, violet, and occasionally orange curtains of light, familiar to those at more northern latitudes. Still, when it comes to matters of the heavens, you don't willy-nilly question the guy who has been called one of the fathers of modern astronomy, so the name stuck. Among those who saw the true diversity of the northern lights, an equally diverse set of mythologies emerged to explain them. The Ottawa people, a tribe that originally lived in what is now eastern Ontario and western Quebec, tell the story of Nunabuzu, a demigod who created the world and all of its inhabitants. After doing so, he journeyed north, but promised that he would not forget his people. From time to time, he lights colossal fires, so that they can see the reflections in the sky and know he is thinking of them. For you Game of Thrones fans, Nunabuzu is essentially Canada's version of Mance Rayder.
When it's time, I'm going to light the biggest fire the North has ever seen.
The Tlingit, and let me just apologize in advance for the butchering of pronunciations you will likely be hearing in this episode, are an indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest who believe that the spirits of warriors who die in battle live on in the sky. These warriors occasionally step out of their celestial dwellings and take the form of the northern lights. As such, the lights are seen by the Tlingit as omens of war. Conversely, the Chippewa people of central Canada viewed the aurora as a herd of heavenly deer, a sign of good hunting to come. The Inuit, by virtue of living across the Arctic lands of Greenland, Canada, and Alaska, have some of the best seats in the house when it comes to aurora gazing, and their mythology is rife with tales of the northern lights because of it. Having descended from hunter-gatherers who crossed the Bering Strait, it should come as no surprise that some Inuit see the lights as the dancing souls of deer, seals, salmon, and beluga whales. Others believe that the aurora is the highest tier of heaven, where those who have died violently can enjoy an eternity of peace. Inuits near Hudson Bay speak of the lights as torches lit by their ancestors to guide the recently departed to the land of the dead. Some Inuit healers believe that the aurora can grant them wisdom, cure disease, or even transport them to the spirit realm or far-off worlds. After the historic Apollo 11 mission to the moon, a journalist asked an elderly Inuk, that's the singular form of Inuit for those interested, what he thought of what was arguably the greatest achievement in mankind's history. The old man responded by saying, what's the big deal? I know Inuit shamans who go to the moon literally all the time. That's me paraphrasing, by the way. Although I've not had the pleasure of meeting one, I'm reasonably sure most Inuits do not sound like Valley Girls. But my favorite Inuit legend by far has to be the one that describes the phenomenon as a group of children laughing, singing, and playing soccer with the skull of a walrus. I don't know exactly why that would produce a sublime spectacle of lights, but it is, as the kids nowadays might say, metal as hell. In Estonia, the lights are described as horses and sleds carrying guests to a magnificent wedding. In Finland, they're the sparks shooting from the tails of magical fire foxes dancing in the sky. The Danes see them as swans caught in the ice, flapping their wings in an attempt to get free. The French see them as marionettes, because of course they do. A number of legends relate to sex, or lack thereof. Ancient Norwegians believe that the aurora was made up of women who died as virgins, dancing and waving white-gloved hands. Some Finns hold a similar belief, that old maids ascend to the sky upon death. A Scottish expression for the Northern Lights is the merry dancers, and according to legend, these dancers are doing the Highlander equivalent of poppin' and lockin' in order to impress a beautiful woman. The Lapps in Sweden say that the lights are girls running around a fireplace with their pants around their ankles. Before you ask, I've got no idea. The Lakota Sioux believe that the aurora are the spirits of future generations waiting to be born, and Japanese tradition has it that children conceived under the lights will be lucky in life. Some people say that looking at the lights will ease the pains of childbirth. Others, that looking directly at them during labor will cause the child to be born cross-eyed. I wish I could give all of my expectant listeners some better advice on this point, but it's a coin toss, really. In addition to slack-jawed wonder and general randiness, the aurora has also inspired its fair share of fear. The Inupiat, a native people of northern Alaska, are quite wary of what they call the Kaguriat, or the spirits who gnaw their teeth. One evening, two Inupiat brothers went out to watch these spirits play soccer in the sky, as the Northern Lights are wont to do. The older brother warned his younger sibling not to talk loudly or whistle, otherwise the spirits might notice them, swoop down, and carry them away. The younger brother, having been bamboozled by his big bro one too many times in the past, scoffed and loudly shouted at the twisting lights to come do their worst. Suddenly, hissing noises cut through the air, and the colors in the night sky began to flash wildly. The older brother grabbed the younger, and together they dove beneath a grove of willows to avoid being snatched up by the spirits. When the lights and hissing eventually faded, the younger brother finally drew in a shaky breath and asked his older brother, "What was it they were playing soccer with? It didn't look like a walrus head." "No," confirmed the older brother. "It was the head of a disobedient child." So I've actually heard a variant of that story before, except when my big brother told it, it was Bloody Mary, who was going to come through a dark mirror to murder me because she thought I stole her baby. To this day, I have trouble going to the bathroom without the lights on. Thanks, Ben. It is oddly comforting, though, to know that across thousands of miles, hundreds of years, and vast cultural divides, big brothers everywhere are, at heart, assholes. Norse mythology, strangely enough, is relatively silent when it comes to explaining the aurora. This is noteworthy in that there are origin stories for just about everything else in Norse mythology. Seriously, they talk about where the thunder, lightning, and the tides come from, what causes earthquakes, the birth of constellations, the source of poetry, both good and bad, and the creation of fish nets. And not even the fun ones, just regular old fish nets. There are 3 possible explanations for this. 1, Norsemen saw the Northern Lights, but they were too busy fighting giants and drinking mead to talk about them. 2, they never saw the aurora. We'll get into this later, but where the aurora can be has shifted over time, so it's possible, if not incredibly probable, that between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Northern Lights simply wasn't a thing in Scandinavia. 3rd, it may be that the aurora is indeed a part of Norse mythology, but we've just been reading it wrong this entire time. For example, the Valkyrie are godlike horsewomen who fly above battlefields. Or, put another way, I love that song. The Valkyrie choose who lives and dies in battle, and escort those who meet worthy deaths to Valhalla. These warrior women wear shields on their back, and some Norse poems describe these shields as glittering with light as they gallop across the sky. Another possibility is the legend of Bifrost, what is commonly known as the Rainbow Road. It's a bridge that connects Midgard, where regular people live, and Asgard, where the gods live. Scholars are split on what the word Bifrost actually means. It could mean shimmering path, trembling road, or the road with three colors. That could be describing a rainbow, but it just as easily could be describing the Milky Way, or the Northern Lights. Having read the better part of 2 whole books on the subject, I'm going to declare myself an expert, and say that Bifrost is the Northern Lights. Boom. Case closed. But the Aurora isn't just an ancient muse. It has continued to spark the imaginations of artists up through the modern age. Countless painters have attempted to capture the flowing colors of the Aurora, perhaps none more famously than Frederick Edwin Church in his 1865 work aptly entitled Aurora Borealis. As many poets have tried to describe the lights in words, with mixed results. There's one in particular I do like, though, written by Jacob Sand in 1939. It's called Hornelen, named after a mountain in Norway. Here are the last 3 verses. Northern lights blaze in the winter night above the dark gorges. Quietly through the night a windharp whispers. Mute death's scream and giant's laughter rises up from the dark deep. Devils are dancing at midnight time. The Jew's harp cuts and shrieks. Roaring laughter and giants play, echoing in the night until cockcrow, and the aurora twitches and shines. Here, gathered together from north and from east and west, trolls and sorcerers. Here they arrange their holy midwinter feast, where Judas is presenter and the devil is priest, while the northern lights rustle and burn. Spooky, right? It's certainly a lot more ominous than most of the poetry lauding the beauty and majesty of the aurora. But see, that's the thing about the Northern Lights. They're unpredictable. One minute they're dancing around a fire without any pants on. The next they're decapitating children because they couldn't find their favorite walrus skull. Neil Young does a good job striking a balance between mirth, melancholy, and menace in his 1979 song, Pocahontas.
Aurora borealis, the icy sky at night. Paddles cut the water in a long and hurried flight from the white man to the fields of green and the homeland we've never seen.
In Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy, the Aurora plays an integral role. If you're not familiar with the series, the books are written for a young adult audience, but it's still one of the best fantasy trilogies of all time. The first volume, called The Golden Compass in the US, but Northern Lights in the United Kingdom, follows a young girl named Lyra, who lives in a mystical and theocratic alternate reality. Her quest is to reach the Northern Lights, which act as a portal to parallel universes. Without giving too much away, there are witches, hot air balloon battles, and sentient polar bears that craft and wear armor made out of meteorites. So you should probably just go give it a read. And if you're scared off by the 2007 film adaptation starring Daniel Craig, rest assured that the book is far superior to the movie. And this is coming from a guy who has seen Casino Royale probably about 24 times. And no overview of the Northern Lights' impact on modern-day culture would be complete without at least passing reference to its namesake's influence on fish fans and college kids the world over.
That is Northern Lights cannabis indica.
No.
It's marijuana.
Of course, for as long as people have been telling stories about the aurora, others have been trying to figure out just exactly what's going on up there. According to the Old Testament, it was in the year 593 BCE that Ezekiel saw the face of God. Quote, "As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud, surrounded by brilliant light, and fire flashing forth continually. In the midst of the fire, gleaming bronze. There was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. Above the firmament there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness as if it were a human form. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." A number of scholars have put forth the idea that what Ezekiel saw was a low-latitude aurora. In 2002, a group of researchers, while not confirming that this was actually what he had witnessed, indicated that the conditions could have been favorable at that time for Ezekiel to see the northern lights as far south as Babylon. But at roughly the same time as Ezekiel experienced his vision, a Greek philosopher called Anaximenes was also gazing upward, quite possibly at that same auroral display. Rather than seeing God in the sky, he saw inflammable exhalations from the earth, or more simply, a cloud of burning gas. Anaximenes was perhaps the first to view the aurora through a scientific lens. Roughly 3 centuries later, Aristotle would take a crack at explaining the northern lights. In his Meteorologia, Aristotle put forth the idea of the 4 basic elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. Little did he know how close he was to summoning Captain Planet. Fire being the lightest of these, in Aristotle's mind, it would naturally float to the top of the Earth's atmosphere. When gases released from the Earth rise and encounter this fire, they ignite, and the resulting light displays are what we see as the aurora. Now, Aristotle is probably one of the smartest people to have ever lived. He basically started the study of logic, and his work spanned subjects from biology, geology, and physics to ethics, theater, and government, to name just a few. What's more, historians estimate that only about a third of Aristotle's scholarship is even known about today. The only problem with this is, if everyone generally agrees that you're one of the smartest people who's ever lived, they're not exactly going to be chomping at the bit to correct you when you're wrong. And although some scientists posited alternative theories about the northern lights in the intervening period, it wasn't until about 2,000 years later that the thinking that the aurora was strictly a gaseous phenomenon began to change. And it took what could be described as an Avengers-level assembly of some of the greatest scientific minds in history to make it happen. The first to do so, the Captain America First Avenger of the effort, if you will, was Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet fame. On March 6, 1716, he witnessed an aurora over the sky of London. Halley lived primarily during what is known as the Maunder Minimum, a period that stretched from roughly 1645 to 1715 that was marked by an unusual absence of sunspots and a general lack of auroral activity. Seeing the northern lights for the first time in his life, Halley was dumbstruck and set out to discover what caused them to occur. He didn't fully buy the idea that gaseous exhalations were the sole source of the lights. Instead, working on a theory that the Earth is filled with spinning concentric spheres, Halley stumbled onto a key element that drives the aurora: magnetism. Anders Celsius, of that temperature scale that everyone else in the world uses except for the US, the Bahamas, Belize, and the Cayman Islands fame, built on Halley's magnetism hypothesis. Celsius, because a lot of his experiments involved seeing how much something could take before it started to boil over, is like the Incredible Hulk of this metaphor. I never said all of these Avengers comparisons were going to be winners, people, okay? Celsius found that variations of a compass needle correlated with the strength of auroral activity, validating Halley's theory. Benjamin Franklin, scientist, international playboy, and possible inspiration for Tony Stark, contributed the idea that electrical current coursing through the atmosphere in the polar regions might produce the aurora, another important piece of the bigger puzzle. Samuel Schwab, a young amateur astronomer, a little bit in over his head, but still trying to play with the big boys, like, I don't know, say Spider-Man maybe, tracked the patterns of sunspots and provided critical data that connected the frequency and intensity of the lights with solar activity. And in 1900, Christian Olaf Birkeland set out on an expedition to the northernmost regions of Norway and finally brought all of the pieces together. He is the Nick Fury, and I'd like to think specifically the version of Nick Fury portrayed by Samuel L. Jackson, of Aurora Borealis research. Honorable auroral Avenger mention goes to Liv Harang, another Norwegian scientist who ran an observatory in Tromsø, Norway. His team made a number of important discoveries about the polar lights until it was taken over by the Germans during World War II. During the 5 years of Nazi occupation, Harang and his researchers used the facility to illegally communicate with the Norwegian government in exile in England. He was arrested in 1945, but survived his imprisonment and lived another 25 years in Oslo. Okay, so we're now more than halfway through this podcast, and I think it's about time we get down to brass tacks and get you an answer to the question, what are the Northern Lights? Again, I'd like to preface this with the admission that I am in no way a scientist. But I have watched a lot of cartoon videos about the aurora, so I think I've got a tenuous hold on the basic idea. It all starts about 93 million miles away, deep within the bowels of the sun. Here, at temperatures above 27 million degrees, Fahrenheit, of course, hydrogen atoms slam into one another, and through a fusion reaction create helium. The energy that is created by these explosions flows outward from the core, toward the surface of the sun, otherwise known as the corona. This flowing energy creates magnetic fields within the sun, which, in some places, breach the surface and extend outward into space. By releasing some of the sun's pent-up energy, the magnetic fields cool the surface of the sun, creating sunspots. So Spider-Man was right. There is a connection between sunspots and auroras. Electrically charged particles called plasma continue to push the magnetic field outward until, like a rubber band pulled too far, the field snaps and hurtles away from the sun. The plasma and accompanying magnetic field streak through space and become what is known as a coronal mass ejection. It's kind of like if the sun were a peeled orange and you squeezed it. Except instead of orange juice, what spews out is billions of tons of plasma that is traveling upwards of 5 million miles per hour. It takes this cloud of plasma a few days to reach Earth, and then we all die in a fiery apocalypse. No, not really. That would be the opposite of cool shit. That would be terrible shit. The Earth is, in fact, protected by something called the magnetosphere. So while Captain America was on the right track with his solid concentric sphere theory, the Earth is actually made up of an inner core of solid iron and nickel, a liquid outer core, also made of iron and nickel, and a liquid but slightly cooler mantle made up of molten rock. The churning that goes on inside the Earth creates our own magnetic fields that create what is effectively a force field around our planet. For the most part, the magnetosphere redirects the plasma around the Earth and off into space. Electrically charged particles, which constantly emanate from the sun and are generally known as the solar wind, are always flowing into the northern and southern poles, creating auroral activity around the clock. But it is these larger coronal mass ejections that can, in a way, overpower our magnetic fields and create the most vibrant light displays. Up until now, I've only really talked about the Aurora Borealis, the northern lights. But the southern lights are also most definitely a thing. They are known as the Aurora Australis, and while there is some debate over who named them, the first European explorer to see and describe the southern aurora was the famous Captain James Cook on his second voyage aboard the HMS Resolution. The only trouble is, the Aurora Australis is largely only visible over Antarctica, so while there are plenty of penguin witnesses, there aren't really that many people around to actually see it. But while it doesn't have nearly as rich a mythos as the Northern Lights, there are a handful of legends that have emerged. The Maori of New Zealand see the lights as their ancestors, who, long ago, traveled south by canoe and became trapped in the ice. When these ancestors light massive bonfires to stay warm in the inhospitable south, the Maori call the reflections the Great Glowing of the Sky. Some Australian Aboriginal tribes believe that the aurora was caused by the feast fires of the Ula Pika, a race of ghostly beings that spoke to the tribal elders through the lights. The Kurnai, a group of indigenous peoples in the southeastern part of Australia, have a tradition of preserving the hand of a dead friend or relative as protection against supernatural danger. When the aurora would appear, Kurnai would wave the dead hand at the sky in an attempt to ward off the wrath of the lights. Among the cultures of the North that also view the aurora antagonistically, this is a pretty common reaction. Not the waving of dead hands necessarily, but waving knives and shouting, and generally trying to shoo the lights away. Far be it from me to tell these people how to live their lives, but if I believed the lights were some kind of immortal sky beings bringing death and destruction to the land, I'd probably just chill inside. But to each their own. Okay, back to the science. So the charged plasma from the sun is directed by the Earth's magnetosphere into the polar regions. And this is where Ben Iron Man Franklin gets somewhat vindicated. These electrically charged particles begin to interact with the neutral oxygen and nitrogen atoms in the Earth's atmosphere. The plasma transfers energy to these gases, and in order to return to a neutral state, the oxygen and nitrogen release that energy in the form of photons, or the elementary particles of light. The photons released from oxygen are responsible for the green and red colors, and the photons released from the nitrogen atoms are seen as blue and red. Together, they create the blazing splendor of the northern and southern lights. And although we now know the basic function of the aurora, there's still a great deal that we're learning. Rockets and high-altitude balloons, launched from the Poker Flat facility, are helping us better understand and predict the lights. In 2007, NASA launched 5 satellites to learn more about conditions in the Earth's magnetosphere that intensify auroral activity. And just to be clear, this research isn't just so that we can get prettier photos of the northern lights, though I could certainly think of a lot worse ways to spend our tax money. Geomagnetic activity can have a huge impact on power grids, communication systems, and spacecraft operations, so it pays to know as much as we possibly can. One of the most hotly debated subjects in modern auroral research has been the question of whether or not we can hear the northern lights. Without a doubt, auroral magnetic activity produces radio emissions at very and extremely low frequencies that can be picked up using special equipment. Here's a sample of that sound, collected by the European Space Agency's Cluster satellite. But these sounds are well below the frequencies that humans should be able to hear. Still, many legends and hundreds of observers describe having heard sounds accompanying the lights. These claims had largely been dismissed, or explained away as a byproduct of the brain becoming overstimulated by the spectacular display of colors. And it does sort of make sense that you shouldn't be able to hear them, since the aurora are happening 60 to 200 miles above our heads. But in 2012, Finnish researcher Unto Lane completed a 12-year study in which he claims to have proof that the aurora does indeed produce sound at a frequency and at an altitude that would make it possible to be picked up by the naked ear. Here is what he says is the ghostly clap of an aurora, produced at a height of only 70 meters. Of course, the beauty of science is that it is a shared pursuit of knowledge. Findings always need to be replicated by others, so you should take Lane's claim, at least for now, with a grain of salt. But if this podcast has inspired you to go aurora hunting yourself, it wouldn't hurt to keep both your eyes and ears open. Which naturally begs the question, how does one go about observing the northern lights? Well, you'll most likely have to go farther than Springfield to do it.
Excuse me for 1 second.
Of course.
Oh, well, that was wonderful. Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
Yes, I should be. Good Lord, what is happening in there?
Aurora borealis?
Aurora borealis. At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within your kitchen.
Yes.
That's it?
No.
Seymour! The house is on fire!
No, Mother, it's just the northern lights.
I know that was a bit of a tortured segue, but there was no way I was doing this podcast without including that clip. Unless you have an invite to one of the 30 or so research stations in Antarctica, odds are good you're going to have to head north. On clear nights with perfect conditions, the aurora can be seen farther south, but generally, the auroral zone extends down to about the 60th parallel north, and includes countries like Iceland, Greenland, Canada, and Russia, along with Alaska and the Scandinavian peninsula. As far as timing, you'll have to aim for the winter months, so bundle up. The northern lights can't be seen during daytime, and because of the Earth's tilt, there isn't a lot of night up north during the summer. Obviously, clear nights are ideal, but that's just a matter of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. I swear this isn't an advertisement for Iceland Air. Not that I would turn the money down if you guys were interested, but I saw the northern lights in Iceland, and to paraphrase Ferris Bueller, if you have the means, I would highly recommend it. Reykjavik is an incredibly fun city, and Iceland is a beautiful country. My partner Hannah and I booked a couple of seats on one of the many bus tours that take you out into the country to try and catch a glimpse of the lights. Our guide was an older Icelandic gentleman who reminded me a lot of a cuddlier version of Werner Herzog.
After 47 years living here, I decided to move to Orlando to be closer to Disney World.
So we set off in this bus out into the Icelandic boonies. Werner uses weather radar and something called the K-index, which tracks geomagnetic activity, to pick a spot for us to camp out and wait for the lights. Thankfully, it was near a little roadside coffee shop, so as we waited outside in the freezing January weather, we at least had some outrageously overpriced hot chocolate to keep us warm. After about 3 hours, though, it started to become clear that tonight just wasn't going to be the night. As we climbed back into the bus, Werner told us that we'd all get refunds, or could come out with him again the following evening. Standing quietly in the cold night after night wasn't exactly what we had in mind for our vacation, so Hannah and I resigned ourselves to the fact that we'd missed our chance to see the lights, at least this go-around. The bus started the journey back to Reykjavik, and, a little sullen and still pretty cold, we started to nod off. Suddenly, the bus veers off the road and comes to a screeching halt on the side of this abandoned country highway. Werner comes on over the PA and says, "Everyone out of the bus." We step out, look up, and a river of pale green is flowing above our heads. Now, pictures of the Aurora Borealis are great. In fact, pictures of the lights are often more vibrant than what you can see in real life, because cameras are able to capture colors that the human eye can't. But if you do feel the need to photograph them, and again, you absolutely should if the mood strikes you, please just don't, like many of my fellow bus travelers did, use the flash. I hope by now I don't need to explain why that won't help. Personally, I was content just to be in the moment. Standing out there and looking up into the night sky, you join millennia of humans who have stood where you stood and saw what you saw. And just like them, you'll begin to search for something. Some story, some song, or some equation to describe this largely indescribable experience. The best I can do is to say that there is some pretty cool shit happening up there. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to the Almighty Universe, Hosp Adam, El Madar, HGath, and Off My Lawn Asshats for leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts. If you've liked what you've heard, I would love it if you rate, review, subscribe to, and share cool shit. You can also drop us a line, either via email at coolshitcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at coolshitcast. Cool Shit's music is by Arnie Bang Huseby, Fatal Injection, and Kai Engel. Until next time.